Chapter 1. Introduction. The Caribbean as a melting pot of history. When you look at the Caribbean, you don't just see a region full of palm trees, turquoise blue sea, and white sandy beaches. One looks at an area that has become a symbol of encounter, conflict, mixing, and resistance like no other. Here on the islands and coasts between North and South America, the paths of peoples and powers have crossed for centuries. This history gave rise to a unique cultural space that continued to produce new identities despite colonialism, violence, and exploitation. The Caribbean is more than a geographical term. It is a space in which history becomes visible in a condensed form. From the indigenous societies that lived here, to the conquest by European powers, the transatlantic slave trade, the plantation economy, piracy and insurgencies, to the independence movements and modern nation-states, all these developments are reflected in the region's islands and coasts. Their importance extends far beyond their size. Although the Caribbean seems small compared to continents, it has been a focal point of world history for centuries. It was here that it was decided how colonial empires functioned, how slavery was organized, and how cultures mixed. It was a place of wealth for the colonial powers, but also a place of immeasurable suffering for the millions of Africans who were deported here. At the same time, the Caribbean was also a space of resistance. Nowhere else have so many slave revolts been recorded, and nowhere else has there been a revolution as in Haiti, which not only shook the colonial power France, but also changed the world order. Impulses emanated from the Caribbean that had an impact far beyond the region, in Europe, in America, yes, worldwide. But the Caribbean is not only a space of conflict, but also one of creativity. In the encounter between indigenous people, Europeans, Africans, and later Asians, a culture emerged that is second to none. Music genres such as reggae, salsa, calypso, and merengue carry the rhythm of this story out into the world. Writers, artists, and thinkers from the Caribbean have been instrumental in shaping how we think about colonialism, identity, and globalization today. Geographically, the Caribbean includes hundreds of islands, from the Greater Antilles, Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, to the Lesser Antilles and the Bahamas. But the adjacent coasts of South and Central America are also closely linked to the history of the Caribbean. Venezuela, Colombia, Guyanas, and the coasts of Central America were part of the same trade and migration movements. The strategic location of the region made it a hub early on. Whoever controlled the Caribbean not only controlled access to the American continent, but also important trade routes across the Atlantic. No wonder then that the European powers fought for influence here with particular severity. Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, and later the United States. They all saw the Caribbean as a key element of their power politics. But beyond the big politics, the everyday life of millions of people also took place. Life on the plantations, the enslavement, the struggles for freedom, and the slow emergence of new societies shape the memory of the region to this day. The Caribbean is therefore a space in which the history of modernity can be read in concentrated form. The discovery of new worlds, the violence of colonialism, the globalization of trade, the question of human rights and freedom, the confrontation with identity and belonging. The Caribbean has always been a place of longing and projection. For the Europeans of the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a paradise full of riches, but also an exotic space that they wanted to bring under control. For slaves, it was a place of horror, but also a space in which hope of escape and freedom opened up. For pirates, it was a battlefield of greed, for missionaries, a field of conversion, for merchants, a gateway to prosperity. In modern times, the Caribbean has become a place that millions of tourists experience as a dream destination. But behind the postcard images lies a story that is far more complex. Poverty, political instability, and the aftermath of colonialism and slavery still shape many societies today. At the same time, however, there is also pride, resilience, and a culture that is recognized worldwide. A script about the history of the Caribbean can therefore not be just a series of facts and figures. It must bridge the gap from indigenous origins to the era of colonization and slavery to today's challenges. It must make the voices of those who are often overlooked audible: the slaves, the insurgents, the ordinary people who survived despite the most adverse circumstances and carried on their culture. This work aims to do just that, to show the Caribbean not only as a geographical space, but as a living scene of world history. It will tell the big lines, the conquests, the revolutions, the political upheavals, but also the quiet voices, the stories of everyday life, survival, and creativity. In the end, it turns out that the Caribbean not only has history, but has made history. It is a space that has decisively shaped modernity. Through sugar and slavery, through revolution and music, through migration and identity. It is a melting pot from which new forms of coexistence have emerged. This is how our journey begins, a journey through centuries, over islands and seas, through times of hope and violence. A voyage that shows that the Caribbean is much more than a dream destination. It is a key to world history. Chapter 2. The Indigenous World. Taino, Arawak, and Caribs. Before European ships reached the Caribbean at the end of the 15th century, the region was by no means an unspoiled paradise. On the contrary, it was home to diverse indigenous peoples who had built complex societies over centuries. Three groups in particular shaped the Caribbean: the Taino, the Arawak, and the Caribs. They left traces in language, culture, and way of life that continue to have an impact today, even if their civilizations were tragically destroyed by the arrival of Europeans. The Taino, the largest and probably best-known group, inhabited the Greater Antilles, islands such as Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. They were farmers, fishermen, and skilled craftsmen. Their villages, the Yucayeques, consisted of round huts arranged around central squares. Ritual ceremonies, dances, and games took place there. The Taino farmed with cassava, corn, sweet potatoes, and beans, but tobacco also played a central role. It was used both as a stimulant and for religious rituals. Their society was organized hierarchically. At the top was the cacique, the chief, who had both political and religious functions. He was assisted by advisors and priests who were considered mediators between humans and gods. Women played an important role, both in agriculture and in religious rituals. It is particularly noteworthy that the Taino lived in a society in which cooperation and community were highly valued. Their religion was characterized by the worship of the Zemes, divine spirits who were depicted in statuettes. Rituals, dances, and songs accompanied everyday life, and the idea of a world full of spiritual forces was deeply rooted. The areto, a ritual dance in which myths, history, and beliefs were passed on, also played a major role. In it, entertainment was combined with education and spiritual practice. The Arawak, a larger language and culture group that included the Taino, were more widespread. They inhabited not only the islands, but also parts of the South American mainland, especially today's Venezuela and Guyanas. Their languages had a lasting impact on the Caribbean. Many words that we use today as a matter of course, such as hammock, canoe, or barbecue, come from the Arawak languages. The Caribs, after whom the region was later named, were very different from the Taino in way of life and reputation. They mainly inhabited the Lesser Antilles and were notorious as a warlike people. Contemporary accounts, often from their opponents, the Europeans, portrayed them as fierce fighters and even cannibals. Modern research relativizes these representations, but also sees them as targeted propaganda to justify their violent subjugation. What is certain, however, is that the Caribs were a militant people who stopped the expansion of the Taino and later stubbornly resisted the Europeans. There were clear tensions between the Taino and the Caribs. The Taino saw the Caribs as a threat, plundering villages in regular raids. For the Caribs, on the other hand, the Taino were a target to expand their power. This rivalry shaped the political landscape of the Caribbean even before the Europeans arrived. Despite their differences, all these peoples were united by a deep knowledge of their environment. They knew how to use natural resources sustainably, farmed in tropical climates, built canoes for trade and seafaring, and developed forms of social organization that enabled stability. Their societies were by no means primitive, as the Europeans later claimed, but highly adapted to the living conditions of the region. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he met the Taino of Hispaniola. They initially welcomed the strangers with hospitality, but the encounter soon led to disaster. Disease, forced labor, and violence decimated the population to an extent that is now called genocide. Within a few decades, the Taino almost completely disappeared, even though their culture and heritage lives on in the population of the Caribbean to this day. It is particularly tragic that the voices of the indigenous peoples themselves have hardly been handed down. What we know about them comes largely from reports by Europeans, often filtered through misunderstandings, prejudices, and political interests. Nevertheless, archaeological finds, linguistic traces, and cultural traditions create a picture that shows the diversity and vitality of these societies. The world of the indigenous peoples was the first great epic in Caribbean history. It laid the foundations on which later developments were built, not only geographically, but also culturally. Many of the foods, words, plants, and traditions of today's Caribbean have their roots in this period. And, although the arrival of the Europeans destroyed this world, it lives on in cultural memory. The history of the Taino, Arawak, and Caribs reminds us that the Caribbean did not begin with Columbus, but had a long past. It was a past full of diversity, creativity, and adaptation to the environment, a past that is often overshadowed but crucial to understanding the Caribbean. Chapter 3: Christopher Columbus and the Discovery of the Caribbean. When Christopher Columbus landed on an island in the Bahamas in October 1492 with his 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, a new chapter in world history began, and a dramatic chapter for the Caribbean. What was celebrated in Europe as the discovery of the New World meant the beginning of conquest, disease, forced labor, and death for the indigenous peoples. Columbus, a Genoese navigator in the service of the Spanish crown, had originally sought a western sea route to India. Instead, he came across the islands of the Caribbean, which he initially thought were offshore parts of Asia. He called the people he met there Indians, a term that still has an effect today, although it is based on an error. His first encounter with the Taino in the Bahamas was friendly. Columbus described them in his reports as peaceful, generous, and easily influenced. He noticed her gold jewelry and saw it as a confirmation of his hope of finding riches. These observations laid the foundation for further Spanish policy. The islands were to serve not only as new colonies, but also as a source of precious metals and labor. From the Bahamas, Columbus sailed on to Cuba and Hispaniola, where he made his first contacts with the societies there. He had the first European settlement in the New World built on Hispaniola, La Navidad. But the tensions were already evident here. The Spaniards took supplies, demanded labor, and began to use force when they encountered resistance. Columbus himself was convinced that he was acting on God's behalf. In his letters to the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, he described the new lands as rich, fertile, and full of possibilities, but at the same time as places that had to be conquered and missionized. His words fueled the urge for expansion and established an era in which the Caribbean became the first experimental field of European colonial rule. Columbus's later voyages deepened this development. On his second voyage in 1493, he brought with him a fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,000 men. This was no longer a voyage of discovery, but a planned colonization. The Spaniards established permanent settlements, forced the Taino to work, and began searching for gold. Soon, there were uprisings which were bloodily suppressed. For the Taino and other indigenous groups, the arrival of Columbus was a disaster. Within a few decades, their populations were decimated, not only by violence and forced labor, but also by diseases brought by Europeans. Smallpox, measles, and flu, against which the indigenous people had no immunity, killed hundreds of thousands. The historian Bartolomé de las Casas, an eyewitness at the time, later spoke of a terrible genocide. Columbus himself soon got into trouble. The settlements he had founded suffered from hunger, disease, and conflict. His harsh rule led to complaints from both colonists and indigenous people. Finally, in 1500, he was deposed by the Spanish crown and sent back to Spain in chains. Nevertheless, he remained a key figure. His voyages had heralded the beginning of European expansion in the New World. The symbolic significance of Columbus's voyages for Europe was enormous. He proved that there were new worlds on the other side of the Atlantic, worlds that could be conquered, converted, and exploited. For Spain, this was the prelude to an empire that stretched over large parts of America. For the Caribbean, however, it meant the end of the Old World and the beginning of a new order that was to shape it for centuries. The so-called discovery was therefore not an encounter at eye level, but the beginning of an asymmetrical process that radically changed the region. The indigenous population was made subjects, their ways of life destroyed, their religions suppressed. They were replaced by Spanish colonies, missions, and a new economic order that would soon be based on slavery and plantations. Columbus himself died in Spain in 1506, disappointed and embittered because he had never found the wealth he had hoped for. But his legacy was far-reaching. He had opened the way for conquerors, missionaries, traders, and adventurers. The Caribbean had become the first point of contact between the Old and New World, and thus the starting point of a globalization whose consequences are still felt today. The story of Columbus shows the ambivalence of Caribbean history. On the one hand, there is the European enthusiasm for new countries, riches, and trade opportunities. On the other hand, there is the suffering of the peoples who lost their homeland, saw their culture destroyed, and had to live under inhumane conditions. In the memory of the inhabitants of the Caribbean, Columbus is therefore a controversial figure to this day. Some celebrate him as an explorer, others condemn him as a symbol of colonialism and oppression. What remains undisputed is the fact that his arrival in 1492 represented a turning point that changed world history and put the Caribbean in the spotlight. Chapter 4: Spanish Conquest and the First Colonial Empire. After Christopher Columbus's voyages, a phase began in which the Spanish crown systematically expanded control over the Caribbean. What began as a voyage of discovery turned into a conquest within a few years, transforming the region into the first major arena of European colonialism. The Caribbean became the laboratory of the Spanish Empire. Here, they tried out forms of domination, proselytizing, and economic exploitation that were later applied throughout the Americas. The Spaniards established their first permanent settlements on Hispaniola, the present-day island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Santo Domingo, founded in 1496, became the first colonial city of the New World and the center of Spanish power in the Caribbean. From here, the Spaniards organized their conquests, shipped gold, and administered their colonies. The city was also the seat of America's first bishop, university, and first judiciary, symbols of Spain's establishment of not only military but also institutional structures. The conquest was based on two pillars: military force and religious legitimacy. The Spanish conquistadors used their superior weapons, steel, horses, and firearms against the indigenous societies, which could not resist such attacks. At the same time, they justified their actions with the claim to spread Christianity. Priests accompanied the conquerors, baptized the indigenous people, and destroyed their religious symbols. The encomienda system introduced by the Spaniards was particularly consequential. It provided that colonists were given the right by the crown to oblige certain groups of indigenous people to work. In return, they were to protect and proselytize them. In practice, this meant forced labor, exploitation, and ill treatment. Many indigenous people had to toil in gold mines or work in fields, often under deadly conditions. Within a few decades, the population shrank dramatically. Contemporary witnesses such as Bartolomé de las Casas reported on the atrocities and denounced them. Las Casas, who had initially owned an encomienda himself, later became a vehement critic of the system. In his writings, he described how entire villages were exterminated and millions of people lost their lives. Although his appeals brought about some reforms, little changed in the basic principle of exploitation. For Spain, the Caribbean was of enormous importance. It served not only as a source of wealth, but also as a springboard for the further conquest of the American continent. From Santo Domingo, expeditions set off for Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and finally to the mainland. Hernán Cortés, for example, started his conquest of the Aztec Empire from Cuba. Thus, the Caribbean was the starting point for an empire that soon stretched from Mexico to Peru. The Spaniards also expanded their role through religion. Monasteries, churches, and missions sprang up in all major settlements. Christianity was used not only as a belief system, but also as a means of disciplining. Indigenous people should discard their old customs and fit into the new order. But not everyone accepted this. Again and again, there were uprisings, but they were usually brutally suppressed. The economic basis of Spanish rule soon shifted from gold mining to agriculture. Sugarcane, which was imported from Asia, proved to be particularly productive. Sugar plantations became the model that was to shape the Caribbean for centuries. But the indigenous workforce was not enough, especially because their numbers were declining so sharply due to disease and exploitation. This marked the beginning of the second momentous development, the introduction of African slaves. The Spaniards brought the first enslaved Africans to the Caribbean as early as the early 16th century. They were supposed to replace the labor that had been lost due to the collapse of the indigenous population. This was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, which was to make the Caribbean a center of suffering but also of cultural transformation in the centuries to come. Meanwhile, the social structure of the islands changed fundamentally. A small white elite of Spanish colonists dominated politics and the economy, while indigenous people and Africans were at the bottom of society. Mixed forms arose through contacts, voluntary or forced, and with them a new, complex social order based on skin color, origin, and status. Politically, Spain secured its rule through a strictly centralized system. The crown retained control over all important decisions, appointed governors, and founded the Consejo de Indias, the Council of the Indians, which watched over the colonies in Seville. At the same time, laws were passed that monopolized trade. Only certain Spanish ports were allowed to trade with the Caribbean. This system was intended to secure Spain's wealth, but it also led to smuggling and later to piracy. The Spanish conquest of the Caribbean was therefore a process of construction and destruction at the same time. It brought new cities, institutions, and religions, but destroyed the indigenous societies that had lived here for centuries. It created a new order based on exploitation and violence, but also laid the foundation for the modern Caribbean. At the end of the 16th century, the Caribbean was firmly in Spanish hands. But its riches and strategic location soon aroused the interest of other European powers. France, England, and the Netherlands were to make their own claims in the 17th century, and this began a phase of competition that turned the Caribbean into a battlefield of empires.
Chapter 5: Sugar, Plantations, and the Birth of Slavery. The Caribbean in the 16th and 17th centuries was shaped by a product that would define its history for centuries: sugar. No other asset has shaped the societies of the region so sustainably. No other has linked the islands so closely to the world economy, and no other has been so closely linked to violence, slavery, and exploitation. The sweet goods made the Caribbean a treasure trove for the colonial powers, and at the same time, one of the cruelest scenes in human history. Sugar cane was originally a plant from Southeast Asia that had reached Europe via the Middle East. Sugar was already known in small quantities in the Middle Ages, but it was considered a luxury good for the upper class. It was only the climatic conditions of the Caribbean that made mass cultivation possible. The sun, the tropical soils, and the proximity to the trade routes offered ideal conditions. As early as the early 16th century, the Spaniards recognized the potential, and soon the Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch followed. Sugar production was labor-intensive and brutal. The clearing of the fields, the planting of the sugarcane, the harvesting with machetes, and the immediate processing in mills and boilers required enormous amounts of manpower. The indigenous peoples, who were initially forced to work, were already severely decimated by disease and forced labor. Thus, the colonial powers increasingly resorted to a new source: enslaved Africans. This marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade that was to shape the Caribbean for centuries. Millions of Africans were forcibly abducted from their home regions, transported on ships under inhumane conditions across the Atlantic, and sold in the plantations of the Caribbean. For the colonial powers, this was a profitable business. Africa supplied slaves, America supplied sugar, and Europe produced goods such as weapons, fabrics, and alcohol that kept the cycle going. This triangular trade system was the foundation of the colonial economy. Life on the sugar plantations was characterized by extreme hardship. The working days often lasted 14 to 16 hours. The physical strain was enormous, and the treatment by the guards was brutal. Disease, hunger, and violence led to high mortality rates. Many enslaved people survived only a few years, so that new workers had to be constantly brought in. Families were torn apart, children were separated from parents, languages and cultures were suppressed. But despite this oppression, many Africans held on to elements of their culture. They brought with them religious practices, music, dances, and traditions that lived on in the Caribbean, mixing with European and indigenous influences. This encounter gave rise to a new Creole culture that still shapes the region today. For the colonial powers, sugar was a blessing. The export brought enormous profits, which financed palaces, armies, and new industries in Europe. Islands such as Barbados, Martinique, Jamaica, or Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, became the most profitable colonies in the world. The Caribbean was at the heart of a global system in which wealth and suffering were inextricably linked. The social structure of the Caribbean reflected this order. At the top were the white planter elites, who often lived in luxurious houses and had great influence on politics and the economy. Among them were free Europeans, traders, and craftsmen. At the bottom were the enslaved Africans, who made up the majority of the population. In between, there was a growing group of mestizos or mulattoes who emerged from relationships between Europeans and Africans. Some of them were free and achieved modest prosperity, others remained trapped in oppression. Sugar made the Caribbean rich, but also unstable. The enormous dependence on a single plant meant that natural disasters, diseases, or price drops could have catastrophic consequences. In addition, the inequality between the small white elite and the large enslaved majority has repeatedly led to tensions. Uprisings were commonplace, and many slaves fled to form so-called maroon communities in hard-to-reach areas, living independently of the colonial powers. The birth of the plantation economy was therefore a turning point in the history of the Caribbean. It connected the region more closely to Europe and Africa, making it the heart of global trade and turning it into one of the richest and cruelest regions in the world. The sugar that glittered on the tables of the European upper class was paid for with blood and sweat. By the end of the 17th century, the Caribbean was firmly integrated into the world economy. Spain had lost its supremacy, and other powers, most notably England and France, now dominated sugar production. The Caribbean had become a symbol of colonialism, rich in natural resources and work, but marked by violence, oppression, and resistance. The sugar plantations were not only an economic phenomenon, but also a cultural and political one. They created new societies that are still marked by the traces of that era. The language, music, religion, and identity of the Caribbean cannot be understood without the experience of sugar and slavery. Chapter 6: Pirates, Buccaneers, and the Golden Age of the Caribbean. When you think of the Caribbean, the image of pirates almost inevitably comes to mind. Black flags with skulls, fast ships, rum barrels, and mysterious treasure islands. This image is romanticized, but it has a real historical core. Between the late 16th and early 18th centuries, the Caribbean was indeed a center of piracy. Here, the paths of European powers, rich merchant ships, and adventurous men who sought their fortune by force crossed. The origins of piracy in the Caribbean are closely linked to colonialism. Spain had taken control of large parts of the region in the 16th century and transported huge quantities of gold, silver, and sugar to Europe. England, France, and the Netherlands, who wanted to build up colonies themselves, specifically supported so-called buccaneers, pirates with an official license. They received letters of capture which allowed them to attack Spanish ships and settlements in the name of their crown. One of the most famous of these buccaneers was Sir Francis Drake. On behalf of the English crown, he raided Spanish ports and ships, looted enormous riches, and was celebrated as a hero in England. For the Spaniards, on the other hand, he was a feared pirate who challenged their rule in the Caribbean. France and the Netherlands also sent their privateers, and soon the Caribbean was a battlefield where trade routes became unsafe. In the 17th century, this developed into the so-called Golden Age of piracy. With the weakening of Spanish supremacy and the rise of other colonial powers, a power vacuum arose that pirates took advantage of. They established bases on remote islands such as Tortuga or the Bahamas and organized raids from there. These places became notorious pirate nests where a harsh life prevailed. Adventurers, deserters, smugglers, and former slaves mingled here, who together equipped ships and challenged the colonial powers. The pirates developed their own rules and structures. On many ships, a kind of democracy prevailed. The spoils were distributed according to fixed quotas, and the captain could be dismissed by the crew if he treated his people badly. These pirate orders seemed almost modern compared to the strict hierarchies of colonial societies. Among the most notorious names of the time are figures such as Henry Morgan, who later became governor of Jamaica, or Blackbeard, who created legends with his fearsome appearance and his propensity for violence. Their raids on Spanish ships and cities such as Panama City made them rich and notorious at the same time. But piracy was more than just an adventure. It was part of Europe's power politics. As long as pirates weakened the enemies of their own nation, they were tolerated or even supported. But as soon as they became a threat to their own trade, the tide turned. From the early 18th century, the colonial powers began to systematically persecute pirates. Executions and public trials were intended to set an example. Nevertheless, the pirates left deep traces in the culture of the Caribbean. They spawned smuggling and illegal markets that helped many people in the region survive away from the colonial powers. They challenged existing hierarchies by uniting people of different origins on their ships. And they shaped the image of the Caribbean as a place of freedom and adventure, an image that was later romanticized in literature and film. The golden age of piracy ended around 1730. The colonial powers had strengthened their fleets, better protected trade routes, and destroyed the pirates' nests. Many pirates were captured and executed, others settled and became respected citizens. Henry Morgan, for example, did not die on the gallows, but as a wealthy plantation owner and governor. But the legacy of the pirates lives on. In the legends, in the stories of treasures, secret islands, and adventurous battles, their memory remains alive. Historically, they were both criminals and part of the global power game that defined the Caribbean. They exploited the weaknesses of the colonial empires and thus became symbols of resistance against an order characterized by exploitation and oppression. The pirate era shows the ambivalence of Caribbean history. It was an era in which violence, greed, and anarchy prevailed, but also a time in which ideas of freedom, equality, and community became visible. Between the plantations where slaves toiled and the ships that brought sugar and gold to Europe, pirates sailed, challenging order and turning the Caribbean into a space of insecurity. In the end, the colonial powers remained the victors. But the stories of Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and the Buccaneers have forever shaped the Caribbean and made it a place where history and myth are inextricably linked.
Chapter 7. The Rivalry of the European Powers, France, England, the Netherlands. After Spain established the first supremacy in the Caribbean in the 16th century, other European powers began to claim the region's wealth and strategic importance. France, England, and the Netherlands wanted to secure their share of sugar, gold, and trade routes, and this began an era of bitter rivalries that turned the Caribbean into a battlefield of empires. The decline of Spain was a gradual process. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish crown had to contend with internal crises, financial problems, and military overstretch. The gigantic silver transports from Mexico and Peru made the empire rich, but they also attracted pirates, buccaneers, and competitors. England, France, and the Netherlands took advantage of this weakness to gain a foothold in the Caribbean. Early on, the English relied on small islands that Spain had neglected. In 1627, they founded their first permanent colony in Barbados, soon followed by Jamaica, Antigua, St. Kitts, and other islands. Sugar became the main product, and the English consistently expanded their plantation system. Jamaica, which they wrested from the Spanish in 1655, developed into one of the most profitable colonies of the British Empire. France concentrated mainly on the western half of Hispaniola, which later became the colony of Saint-Domingue, as well as on Martinique, Guadeloupe, and other islands. Saint-Domingue soon became the richest colony in the world, producing more sugar and coffee than any other region. The plantation economy there was based on the massive abduction of African slaves, which formed the basis for the later slave revolt and the Haitian Revolution.
The Netherlands, in turn, established itself on smaller islands such as Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire. Curaçao, in particular, became an important center of the slave trade. From here, Dutch traders organized the shipment of hundreds of thousands of Africans to the Caribbean. The Netherlands relied less on sugar plantations and more on trade, smuggling, and shipping. They became the intermediaries between Europe, Africa, and America and benefited enormously from their role as traders. The rivalries between the powers expressed themselves not only in economic competition, but also in military conflicts. Again and again, wars broke out in Europe, which were directly transferred to the Caribbean. The islands became battlefields, ports changed hands, and fleets fought for supremacy. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which was also called the First World War in Europe, was particularly fierce. In the Caribbean, it led to fierce fighting between England and France. In the end, England emerged victorious and took control of numerous French colonies. British supremacy in the Caribbean was thus consolidated. But even after this war, the region remained unstable. France took another swing with Saint-Domingue and made the colony the heart of its colonial economy. England, in turn, used Jamaica and Barbados as bases to secure its global trade. The Netherlands retained its role as a middleman, even if its power declined compared to the two great powers. The rivalries had a profound impact on the people of the Caribbean. For the enslaved Africans, it made little difference whether they worked on a British, French, or Dutch plantation. Brutal conditions prevailed everywhere. But the constant changes of power meant insecurity, destruction, and flight. Some used wars to flee or join insurgencies. The white planters, on the other hand, often benefited from the rivalries. They were able to sell their products in different markets, smuggled goods between the colonies, and used the competition of the powers for their own purposes. At the same time, however, they also became targets of pirates and enemy fleets who plundered their plantations. The rivalry also led to the cultural diversity of the Caribbean. Each colonial power brought its language, religion, and legal systems with it. This is still reflected in the region today. English, French, Dutch, and Spanish characterize the islands, plus African languages that mixed with European. The legal system and administration also bear traces of this colonial past. By the end of the 18th century, the Caribbean had become a mosaic of different colonial empires. Spain was largely pushed back, England and France dominated, and the Netherlands asserted itself as a trader. But the tensions that this rivalry created also prepared the ground for revolutions. Nowhere was this more evident than in Haiti, where the brutal opposition between a wealthy planter elite and an exploited majority of slaves eventually culminated in an uprising that shook the world. The rivalry of the European powers made the Caribbean a mirror of Europe, but also a place where people suffered from colonialism, war, and exploitation. It led to the region becoming deeply involved in global networks, but always overshadowed by the interests of others. The Caribbean thus became the plaything of the great powers, and at the same time, the starting point for developments that changed the world.
Chapter 8: The Colonies as Laboratories of Colonialism. The Caribbean was not only a scene of European rivalries, but also a field of experimentation for the practice of colonialism. Nowhere else did the European powers so consistently test models of domination, economy, and society that were later applied in other parts of the world. The islands became laboratories in which the interplay of plantation farming, slavery, missionary work, and administration was tested and perfected. The basis of this colonial experiment was the plantation. Sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton were grown in monocultures, the organization of which was highly rationalized. Every step of the process was fixed, the workforce was assigned according to clear rules, and the entire process was designed to achieve maximum profits. The plantation was thus an early form of capitalist mode of production that functioned at the expense of enslaved people. On these plantations, a social model became visible that would have been unthinkable in Europe itself. A small elite of white planters and colonial officials controlled political and economic power. They lived in villas, imported luxury goods from Europe, and adhered to the fashions and norms of their homeland. On the other hand, there was a huge majority of enslaved Africans who had no rights and lived in inhumane conditions.
Between these two extremes, a third group emerged, the so-called free colored people, or mulattoes. Many of them were descendants of European men and African women. Some received their freedom, whether by ransom, by the decision of a father, or by their own merits. Some of these free-colored people became wealthy themselves, owned land, and even slaves. But despite their wealth, they remained disadvantaged in a society that was highly hierarchical according to skin color. The colonial powers used the Caribbean to test administrative systems that were supposed to secure the export of wealth. Trade monopolies ensured that the colonies were only allowed to trade with the motherland. In this way, the profits flowed to Europe, while the islands themselves often sank into poverty. Port cities such as Bridgetown in Barbados, Cap Francais in Saint-Domingue, or Port Royal in Jamaica were transshipment points where European goods arrived and sugar, rum, and coffee were shipped around the world. The religious dimension also played a central role. Missionaries, especially Catholic orders such as the Jesuits or Dominicans, tried to Christianize the enslaved Africans and the few remaining indigenous people. But these religions mixed with African belief systems. This is how syncretic religions such as Vodou in Haiti or Santeria in Cuba emerged, which combined elements of Christianity with African gods. The colonies were thus also laboratories of cultural fusion. The experience of coercion and violence also generated new forms of resistance. Uprisings, escapes, and the founding of maroon communities showed that the enslaved people were not simply victims, but actively sought freedom. These communities in remote areas such as the mountains of Jamaica or the forests of Suriname developed their own social orders that existed independently of the colonial powers. They were early examples of alternative forms of society that emerged in the colonial system. It is also interesting to see how much the Caribbean shaped the European perception of race and order. In the colonies, a system emerged that classified people according to skin color and assigned them certain rights or obligations. This thinking, which was later solidified in racial theories in the 19th century, had its origins in the colonial experiences of the Caribbean. For the first time, a consistent distinction was made between whites, blacks, and half-breeds, categories that legitimized social hierarchies. The Caribbean was thus not just a peripheral space, but a center in which ideas and practices were tried out that later had a global effect. It was a forerunner of modern economic and social systems, but in an extreme and brutal form. Capitalism, racism, and colonialism combined here to form a model that both enriched Europe and enslaved millions of people. On the other hand, the Caribbean was a space in which cultural diversity emerged. Languages, musical styles, food cultures, and religious practices merged. African drums met European instruments, indigenous plants were combined with African and European culinary traditions, and new forms of expression emerged. The Caribbean was a laboratory not only of domination, but also of creativity. For the colonial powers, the success of the Caribbean was ambivalent. On the one hand, it brought immense riches. Sugar, rum, and coffee made France, England, and the Netherlands global economic powers. On the other hand, the colonies were highly unstable. The constant threat of uprisings, diseases, pirates, and international wars made the region an unsafe terrain. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the Caribbean was not a sideshow, but a core area of colonialism. Systems were developed here that had far-reaching consequences for the world. It showed the possibilities and limits of European power, the brutality of the slave trade, but also the resilience of the oppressed. The Caribbean as a laboratory of colonialism was a place where modernity became visible in all its contradictions. Progress and cruelty, wealth and suffering, oppression and resistance. It was a mirror of the world and a harbinger of coming revolutions.
Chapter 9. The Life of the Slaves. Everyday Life, Resistance, Culture. The heart of Caribbean societies in colonial times beat on the plantations, not in the magnificent houses of the white planter elites, but in the fields, huts, and communities of enslaved people. Millions of Africans were deported to the Caribbean against their will to work on sugar, coffee, or tobacco plantations. Their everyday lives were marked by coercion, suffering, and violence, but at the same time, they developed strategies of survival, resistance, and cultural self-assertion. The daily routine of a slave was determined by hard work. Before sunrise, men, women, and often children had to appear in the fields. The sugarcane demanded tireless physical effort, planting, weeding, harvesting, and dragging the heavy stems to the mills. During the harvest season, when the sugarcane had to be processed immediately, they worked until late at night. Only short breaks were allowed, and the rations of food were often barely enough to survive. The conditions in the sugar factories were even worse. There, slaves had to press the pipe and thicken the juice in boiling kettles. Burns, accidents, and exhaustion were commonplace. Those who were no longer efficient were replaced. The system was based on treating people like interchangeable tools. In addition to physical work, constant control by overseers and planters was a source of fear and violence. Lashes, chains, and other punishments were intended to enforce obedience. Sexualized violence was also common, as many white planters abused enslaved women. The psychological wounds left behind by this treatment were just as severe as the physical ones. Despite this brutality, the slaves developed their own world of survival. In the cramped huts, in nocturnal gatherings, or in hidden rituals, a culture emerged that both preserved African traditions and produced new forms. Religion played a central role in this. Many were forcibly baptized, but they mixed Christian elements with African beliefs. This is how Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, or Obeah in Jamaica were born. Religions that offered spiritual strength and were at the same time an active resistance to complete assimilation. Music and dance were other forms of expression that provided both comfort and community. Drums, chants, and rhythmic movements were reminiscent of the African homeland and created a feeling of togetherness. Songs often conveyed secret messages or were used to plan escapes and uprisings. These musical traditions laid the foundation for the Caribbean's later cultural identity. Language also became a tool of resistance. Creole languages developed on many islands, composed of African languages, European idioms, and new expressions. These languages were an expression of their own identity, which eluded the grasp of the colonial masters. Resistance took many forms. Some slaves tried to escape the system by fleeing. In hard-to-reach areas such as the mountains of Jamaica or the forests of Suriname, maroon communities emerged in which escaped slaves built up their own societies. These groups were often armed, defending their freedom, and sometimes even making treaties with the colonial powers to secure their independence. Others offered silent resistance. They worked more slowly, sabotaged equipment, refused orders, or killed themselves and their children in order to escape the grasp of the masters. Such acts were an expression of the will not to be completely subjugated, even if they were not always spectacular. Again and again, there were also open riots. As early as the 16th century, slaves rose up against their oppressors, but most uprisings were bloodily suppressed. Nevertheless, they were a constant expression of the instability of the system. But planters lived in fear that the numerically far superior slaves might rise. This fear shaped politics, led to brutal repression, and created an atmosphere of insecurity. So, the life of the slaves was not only a story of suffering, but also a story of resilience. They created new family and community structures, although their biological families were often torn apart. Fictitious kinship relationships, uncles, aunts, siblings in the figurative sense, helped to build social networks that offered protection and support. The culture that emerged in these communities had a profound impact on the Caribbean. Cuisine, language, music, religion, all of this bore African traces and combined with European and indigenous elements. Without the creativity and resistance of the enslaved people, the Caribbean would not be what it is today culturally. For the colonial powers, this life of slaves was only a means to an end, maximum exploitation. For the slaves themselves, it was a daily struggle for survival, but also a struggle that preserved dignity, identity, and hope. In retrospect, it becomes clear that although the plantations were places of immeasurable suffering, they were also breeding grounds for resistance, creativity, and cultural renewal. The life of slaves in the Caribbean was therefore not only a history of oppression, but a history of strength, a strength that eventually culminated in uprisings such as the Haitian Revolution.
Chapter 10. Maroon Communities and Early Uprisings.
In addition to the daily work on the plantations and silent resistance, escape was one of the most important strategies used by enslaved people to try to escape oppression. In the mountains, swamps, and forests of the Caribbean, communities of refugees, the so-called Maroons, emerged. They embodied the ideal of freedom in the midst of a world of slavery and became symbols of resistance. The term maroon is derived from the Spanish word cimarron, which originally meant feral or runaway. As early as the 16th century, enslaved Africans fled from the Spanish plantations on Hispaniola and founded their own settlements. From there, the phenomenon spread throughout the Caribbean. Especially in Jamaica, Suriname, Cuba, and the Greater Antilles, permanent maroon communities developed that not only survived but often resisted for decades. The locations of these communities were deliberately chosen. They were often located in regions that were difficult to access: dense forests, swampy coasts, or mountainous areas that the colonial masters could hardly penetrate. There, the Maroons built villages, farmed, hunted, and organized their defenses. Their societies were strongly influenced by African traditions and combined them with new elements that they developed in the Caribbean. The Maroons were not only survivors but also fighters. With guerrilla tactics, they attacked plantations, freed more slaves, and captured weapons. Their attacks terrified the planters. Especially in Jamaica, the Maroons waged decades-long wars against the British colonial rulers. In the end, the British were forced to conclude treaties with them. In the so-called Maroon Treaties of 1739 and 1740, the Maroons were granted autonomy over certain territories in exchange for a commitment not to take in any more slaves. In Suriname, a Dutch colony, similar communities emerged. There, the Maroons waged a small war against the plantation owners for centuries. Here, too, treaties were made that assured them a degree of independence. To this day, there are descendants of these groups who have preserved their culture and traditions. The Maroon communities were thus a living example of the possibility of escaping the system of slavery. They questioned the colonial order and showed that freedom was possible even under the harshest conditions. For many enslaved people on the plantations, the Maroons were a symbol of hope, even if not all of them managed to flee to them. In addition to these escape communities, there were always open uprisings. As early as the early 16th century, slaves rebelled on Hispaniola. However, such uprisings were difficult to organize, as the colonial powers imposed brutal punishments and tried to suppress any form of solidarity. Nevertheless, there were numerous surveys that showed that the system of slavery was never completely secure. A well-known example is the Tacky Uprising in Jamaica in 1760. Thousands of slaves rose up against the British, conquered plantations, and killed planters. Although the uprising was crushed, it shook the confidence of the colonial masters and showed how fragile their rule was. Similar rebellions occurred in Barbados, Guadeloupe, Cuba, and elsewhere. The plantation owners lived in constant fear of uprisings. Many of them built fortifications, kept militias ready, and imposed draconian laws. Even small violations were severely punished to set an example. But the harder the repression, the greater the determination of many slaves to fight for their freedom. Resistance was not only military, but also cultural. By preserving their African traditions, the Maroons represented a counterweight to forced assimilation. Religions such as Vodou in Haiti or Kumina in Jamaica were not only spiritual practices, but also expressions of self-assertion. In rituals, dances, and songs, the people kept their identity alive and strengthened cohesion. The significance of the Maroon communities and the early uprisings extends far beyond the immediate Caribbean. They showed that resistance was possible even in a system of extreme oppression. They questioned the colonial order and showed that freedom was possible even under the harshest conditions. For many enslaved people on the plantations, the Maroons were a symbol of hope, even if not all of them managed to flee to them. In addition to these escape communities, there were always open uprisings. As early as the early 16th century, slaves rebelled on Hispaniola. However, such uprisings were difficult to organize, as the colonial powers imposed brutal punishments and tried to suppress any form of solidarity.
Nevertheless, there were numerous surveys that showed that the system of slavery was never completely secure. A well-known example is the Tacky Uprising in Jamaica in 1760. Thousands of slaves rose up against the British, conquered plantations, and killed planters. Although the uprising was crushed, it shook the confidence of the colonial masters and showed how fragile their rule was. Similar rebellions occurred in Barbados, Guadeloupe, Cuba, and elsewhere. The plantation owners lived in constant fear of uprisings. Many of them built fortifications, kept militias ready, and imposed draconian laws. Even small violations were severely punished to set an example. But the harder the repression, the greater the determination of many slaves to fight for their freedom. Resistance was not only military, but also cultural. By preserving their African traditions, the Maroons represented a counterweight to forced assimilation. Religions such as Vodou in Haiti or Kamina in Jamaica were not only spiritual practices, but also expressions of self-assertion. In rituals, dances, and songs, the people kept their identity alive and strengthened cohesion. The significance of the Maroon communities and the early uprisings extends far beyond the immediate Caribbean. They showed that resistance was possible even in a system of extreme oppression. They provided inspiration for later movements, especially the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and became the world's first successful slave revolution. For the colonial powers, the Maroons were a constant nuisance. They were emblematic of the failure of complete control over the enslaved population. Despite all the violence, despite all the punishments, and despite military pressure, the colonial masters never succeeded in completely suppressing the longing for freedom. In retrospect, the Maroon communities appear as small islands of freedom in a sea of oppression. They were places of hope, self-determination, and cultural continuity. Their legacy lives on to this day in their descendants who preserve their stories, their music, and their traditions. The early uprisings and Maroon Wars made it clear that slavery in the Caribbean was never stable. It was based on coercion and violence, but it was accompanied by resistance from the beginning. This resistance grew over time until it finally unfolded a force in the Haitian Revolution that changed not only the Caribbean, but the entire history of the world.
Chapter 11. Haiti, the revolution that shook the world. The Haitian Revolution was one of the most dramatic and momentous events in world history. It began in 1791 as a slave revolt on the French colony of Saint-Domingue and led to the founding of the independent state of Haiti in 1804, the first free republic of Black people and the first nation in modern times to completely abolish slavery. No other event showed so clearly that the colonial system was built on violence and that the oppressed had the strength to fight for their freedom. Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the world at the end of the 18th century. It produced more sugar and coffee than any other region and was the economic heart of the French colonial empire. This wealth was based on the work of around 500,000 enslaved Africans who lived in inhumane conditions on the plantations. The white population consisted of a small planter elite and a larger group of poorer colonists. In between, there was a group of free people of color who could achieve prosperity but were disadvantaged by discriminatory laws. The French Revolution of 1789 acted as a spark in this explosive society. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity also reached the Caribbean. Free people of color demanded equal rights, poor whites wanted more influence, and the slaves longed for liberation. The tensions erupted in 1791 in a large uprising in the north of the island. Thousands of slaves attacked plantations, killed planters, and set fields on fire. The French colonial power reacted with brutal violence, but the insurgents did not allow themselves to be crushed. Among its leaders, charismatic personalities emerged, above all Toussaint Louverture. He was a former slave who had been educated and proved to be a brilliant strategist. Louverture united the rebels, organized them militarily, and cleverly exploited the rivalries between France, Spain, and England, all of whom were fighting for control of the island. In 1794, when the revolution in France itself became more radical, the French National Convention decided to abolish slavery in all colonies. This officially gave Louverture the status of a French general, and his army now fought in the name of the Republic against the external enemies. The slaves in Saint-Domingue were free, at least on paper. But the fighting continued as England and Spain wanted to seize the opportunity to conquer the colony. Louverture managed to repel both powers and gain control of the entire island. Under his leadership, Saint-Domingue became an autonomous region within the French Empire. He enforced labor rules that continued to require strict discipline but were based on free labor contracts. His goal was to preserve the island's economy while ensuring the freedom of the people. But the peace did not last long. When Napoleon Bonaparte took power in France, he wanted to restore control of Saint-Domingue and introduce slavery. In 1802, he sent a large army under the command of his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc. At first, it seemed as if the French could reconquer the island. Louverture was captured and taken to France, where he died in prison in 1803. But his legacy lived on. The rebels continued the fight, now under the leadership of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He led a merciless campaign against the French troops, who were further weakened by yellow fever. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines proclaimed Haiti's independence. Slavery was abolished, and the first republic of black people was born. The effects of this revolution were enormous. For the enslaved people in the Caribbean and America, Haiti was a beacon of hope. For the first time, a slave revolt had not only succeeded, but overthrown an entire system. Haiti was a shock for the colonial powers. Planters and politicians in France, England, Spain, and the USA feared that similar uprisings could also occur in their colonies. In fact, the Haitian Revolution inspired numerous movements. There were intensified uprisings in Jamaica, Cuba, and other islands, and in South America too. Independence fighters such as Simón Bolívar drew inspiration from Haiti. But at the same time, the colonial powers reacted with increased repression to prevent similar developments. For Haiti itself, the victory was an ambivalent legacy. Although the country had won its freedom, the international community reacted hostilely. France refused to recognize it, and later extorted high compensation payments. The US and other countries feared a bad example and isolated Haiti diplomatically and economically. The young country had to contend with enormous obstacles that burdened its development for centuries. Despite these difficulties, the Haitian Revolution remains a unique event in world history. It showed that the ideals of freedom and equality applied not only to Europeans, but also to the enslaved of the colonies. It refused the racist argument that Africans were incapable of self-governance, and it changed the geopolitical landscape of the Caribbean. In the collective memory of the region, Haiti is still a symbol of resistance and self-liberation. The Revolution of 1791 to 1804 changed not only the Caribbean, but also the world. It forced Europe to rethink its notions of power and domination, and it opened up new avenues for the struggles against colonialism and slavery.
Chapter 12: The Decline of Spain and the Rise of New Powers. At the beginning of European expansion in the 16th century, Spain was the undisputed supremacy in the Caribbean. With the founding of Santo Domingo, the establishment of colonial structures, and access to the vast riches of Latin America, the Spanish Empire seemed unshakable. But over the centuries, the power structure changed fundamentally. Spain gradually lost its influence, while other powers, above all England and France, and later the United States, entered the Caribbean stage. The decline of Spain had several causes. On the one hand, it lay in the internal problems of the empire. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain waged almost continuous wars in Europe, against the Turks, the French, the Dutch, and other powers. These military adventures devoured vast sums of money, which could not be covered permanently even by the silver fleets from America. Inflation, corruption, and a rigid trading system further weakened the empire. On the other hand, the Caribbean itself was a difficult area for the Spaniards. Many islands were small, difficult to defend, and economically unattractive compared to the rich silver mines of Mexico and Peru. Spain concentrated its resources on the mainland, leaving many Caribbean islands largely unguarded.
This opened the door for rivals such as France, England, and the Netherlands, which began to establish their own colonies in the 17th century. The pirates and buccaneers who afflicted Spain in the first decades were only the prelude. Over time, the other powers firmly established themselves in the region. England took over Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. France occupied Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the western part of Hispaniola. The Netherlands secured Curaçao and other small islands. Spain held on to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, but its supremacy was lost. A decisive blow came in the 18th century. In the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, England conquered Havana, the heart of Spanish power in the Caribbean. Although the city was later returned in exchange for Florida, the episode clearly showed how vulnerable Spain had become. The loss of Trinidad to the British in 1797 also illustrated the decline. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 exacerbated the crisis. Spain not only lost influence on Hispaniola, but also had to watch as the most successful plantation colony in the world, Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, withdrew from the colonial system. For Spain, which was already weakened, this meant a further loss of prestige. In the early 19th century, the disintegration of the Spanish Empire accelerated. The independence movements in South America, led by figures such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, decisively weakened the Spanish position. When most Latin American colonies gained their independence between 1810 and 1825, Spain's empire shrank to a few Caribbean islands. Cuba and Puerto Rico remained the last bastions of Spanish power. But these islands were also increasingly the target of international interests. Cuba became one of the largest producers of sugar and tobacco in the 19th century, making it indispensable to the global economy. The USA watched the island with growing interest and developed plans early on to integrate it into its sphere of influence. Puerto Rico was just as strategically important, but could hardly bring back the glamour of yesteryear. While Spain was weakening, other powers were rising. England finally established itself as the leading colonial power in the Caribbean. With Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, the British had some of the most productive sugar islands. They also used their naval power to control the slave trade, which they officially banned from 1807, and to expand their dominance in the region. France, weakened by the loss of Haiti, held Martinique and Guadeloupe, but could no longer achieve the same dominance as before. Nevertheless, these islands remained important production sites, and parts of the French colonial empire, which was more concentrated on Africa in the 19th century. The Netherlands played a smaller but consistent role. Their islands, including Curaçao and Suriname, remained important hubs in trade. Curaçao, in particular, developed into a melting pot of cultures, where European, African, and Jewish traditions met. The new great power, however, was the United States. As early as the early 19th century, with the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, they formulated the claim that no further European colonial powers should gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. As a result, the Caribbean increasingly became a zone of American interests. The USA bought Louisiana, conquered Florida, and looked with desire at Cuba and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was just as strategically important, but could hardly bring back the glamour of yesteryear. While Spain was weakening, other powers were rising. England finally established itself as the leading colonial power in the Caribbean. With Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, the British had some of the most productive sugar islands. They also used their naval power to control the slave trade, which they officially banned from 1807, and to expand their dominance in the region. France, weakened by the loss of Haiti, held Martinique and Guadeloupe, but could no longer achieve the same dominance as before. Nevertheless, these islands remained important production sites, and parts of the French colonial empire, which was more concentrated on Africa in the 19th century. The Netherlands played a smaller but consistent role. Their islands, including Curaçao and Suriname, remained important hubs in trade. Curaçao, in particular, developed into a melting pot of cultures, where European, African, and Jewish traditions met. The new great power, however, was the United States. As early as the early 19th century, with the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, they formulated the claim that no further European colonial powers should gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. As a result, the Caribbean increasingly became a zone of American interests.
The USA bought Louisiana, conquered Florida, and looked with desire at Cuba and Puerto Rico. The decline of Spain and the rise of new powers made the Caribbean a stage for global shifts. A Spanish Sea became a space of competition in which various empires fought for influence. The islands themselves were rarely subjects of their history. They were controlled, exploited, and strategically used from the outside. But in the midst of these changes, the awareness of the Caribbean population also grew. The memory of the Haitian Revolution remained alive, and more people began to question the colonial order. Spain could no longer stop the change. Its last bastions in the Caribbean were to be lost for good in the late 19th century, and this marked the end of an era that had begun almost 400 years earlier with Columbus.
Chapter 13. The Caribbean in the 19th Century, Independence and Colonial Rule. The 19th century was a time of profound upheaval for the Caribbean. While numerous states on the American mainland fought for their independence from Spain and Portugal, the Caribbean remained firmly in colonial hands. Only Haiti was an exception, with its successful revolution, and became a symbol of freedom. On the other islands, however, the European powers, England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, continued to dominate, turning the region into a mosaic of colonies in which the old plantation system gradually crumbled but continued to have an effect for a long time. The Haitian Revolution of 1804 had shown that independence was possible, but the other islands were not able to take this path immediately. After the upheavals in Saint-Domingue, the colonial powers were determined to prevent similar developments by all means. In addition, the Caribbean was too important economically. Sugar, coffee, and rum continued to be sought-after export products. For the European elites, the preservation of the plantation colonies was essential for survival. At the same time, the 19th century was marked by a gradual erosion of slavery. Pressure from Europe grew, not least due to humanitarian movements and the Industrial Revolution. Great Britain, the leading empire of the time, played a key role here. In 1807, it banned the transatlantic slave trade, and in 1834, slavery itself was finally abolished in the British colonies. This was an epochal turning point. Hundreds of thousands of people were given freedom in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and other islands. However, the abolition was by no means the end of oppression. Many former slaves had to continue to work on the plantations, often under extremely precarious conditions. The plantation owners tried to bind their workers through new laws and contractual constraints. In addition, a system of indentured labor was introduced. Contract workers from India, China, and other regions were brought to the Caribbean to replace the labor of the liberated. This migration changed society permanently and led to new cultural entanglements. In the French colonies, the development was similar. After the brief abolition of slavery during the French Revolution, it was reintroduced by Napoleon in 1802. It was not until 1848 that it was finally abolished in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana. Here, too, the plantation economy remained, albeit with changed work structures. Spain held on to slavery the longest. In Cuba and Puerto Rico, slaves continued to be used until the abolition was enforced in the second half of the 19th century. During this time, Cuba developed into the most important sugar producer in the world. At the same time, the independence movement grew there, which challenged Spain in several uprisings. Finally, the Netherlands did not abolish slavery in Suriname and the Antilles until 1863. But here too, contract workers from India and Java were brought in to keep the plantation economy alive. The societies of the Caribbean changed fundamentally in the 19th century. From a world shaped by slavery, a new order emerged in which different ethnic groups lived together: Africans, Europeans, Indians, Chinese, and descendants of mixtures of all these groups. This diversity created tensions, but also cultural dynamics. The Caribbean finally became a melting pot of languages, religions, and traditions. Politically, however, the region remained fragmented. While nation-states emerged on the mainland, colonial regimes continued to rule in the Caribbean. Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands retained their territories, and only Haiti was the great exception. For many residents, independence was a distant goal that would not become a reality until the 20th century. Nevertheless, the international importance of the Caribbean remained high.
Sugar, rum, and tobacco continued to be key export goods, even though the Industrial Revolution in Europe increased the demand for other raw materials. In addition, the region increasingly became the focus of the United States due to its strategic location between North and South America. With the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the United States declared the Western Hemisphere its sphere of interest and warned the European powers against further expansion. This marked the beginning of a new phase in which the United States gradually gained influence in the Caribbean. The tensions between colonial rule, economic change, and social diversity made the 19th century a transitional period. On the one hand, the old order of slavery had collapsed, and on the other hand, the islands continued to be integrated into colonial structures. People lived between hope and dependence, between tradition and new social realities. The 19th century also brought significant developments in the cultural field. The liberated and the new immigrants formed new forms of expression in music, religion, and language. Creole identities were strengthened, and in many regions there was a growing awareness of their own distinctiveness in relation to the European metropolises. At the end of the century, it became apparent that the Caribbean would enter a new era. Spain lost its last major colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico, in the war against the USA in 1898. This finally ended the era of Spanish rule, and the United States took center stage as a new power. The Caribbean was at the beginning of a new phase in which colonial rule and independence movements, American influence, and national self-determination were to determine the fate.
Chapter 14: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Spanish-American War. At the end of the 19th century, two islands became the focus of world politics: Cuba and Puerto Rico. Both were Spain's last significant possessions in the Caribbean, and they became a bone of contention in a conflict that fundamentally changed the balance of power in the region. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a turning point. It ended Spain's centuries-long presence in the New World and ushered in the era of American influence in the Caribbean. Cuba was Spain's most valuable colony in the 19th century. The island produced huge quantities of sugar, tobacco, and rum, which were in demand on the world markets. But the economic boom was accompanied by political repression. Spain held on to its rule and responded to any demand for reform or self-determination with repression. This led to a growing independence movement. As early as 1868, the so-called 10 Years' War broke out, a first major uprising against Spanish rule. Although he failed after 10 years, he left behind a strong nationalist consciousness. In the 1890s, a new revolt occurred, this time led by figures such as José Martí. Martí was a poet, journalist, and political thinker who called for Cuba's independence with passionate words. He died in battle in 1895, but became a symbolic figure of the Cuban nation. Puerto Rico played a different role. There, too, there was dissatisfaction with Spanish rule, but the independence movement was weaker than in Cuba. Puerto Rico had been granted limited autonomy in 1897, which allowed it to elect its own parliament. But these reforms came too late to stop the dramatic developments that were soon to follow. The United States watched the events closely. They had economic interests in Cuba, where American investors owned large plantations. In addition, the island was only 150 kilometers from Florida and was considered strategically important. In the U.S. public, sympathy for the Cuban rebels grew, fueled by a sensational press denouncing Spanish brutality. The trigger for the war was the explosion of the American warship Maine in the port of Havana in February 1898. The causes of the explosion are still disputed today, but at the time, the U.S. press immediately blamed Spain. Under pressure from public opinion, the U.S. government declared war in April 1898. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but its consequences were enormous. American troops landed in Cuba, supported by Cuban rebels. In the famous Battle of San Juan Hill, a regiment fought under Theodore Roosevelt, who would later become President of the United States. At the same time, the U.S. Navy defeated the Spanish fleet in the Bay of Santiago de Cuba. Spain was militarily inferior and soon had to capitulate. Puerto Rico was also occupied by U.S. troops. The Spanish army put up little resistance, and the island fell into American hands practically without a fight. In the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, Spain had to give Cuba independence, cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and sell the Philippines. This ended Spain's almost 400-year presence in the Caribbean.
For Cuba, the war meant an ambivalent victory. Although the island received its formal independence, the USA retained great influence. With the Platt Amendment of 1901, they secured the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and maintain military bases, including Guantanamo, which is still under American control today. Cuba was officially independent, but in fact a protectorate of the United States. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, remained permanently under American rule. In 1917, the inhabitants received U.S. citizenship, but the island did not become a federal state, but an unincorporated territory. To this day, Puerto Rico is part of the USA, but without full voting rights in Congress and without equal status. This ambivalent position continues to shape the island's politics to the present day. The Spanish-American War fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Caribbean. Spain was finally ousted from the region, and the United States took its place. This marked the beginning of a new era in which the Caribbean was no longer just a colonial area of Europe, but increasingly came under the influence of the United States. At the same time, the war showed the importance of the Caribbean for world politics. The islands were important not only because of their raw materials, but also because of their strategic location. Whoever controlled Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Antilles controlled the entrances to the Gulf of Mexico, the Panama Canal, and the trade routes between North and South America. For the people in the Caribbean, the war brought new hopes but also new dependencies. In Cuba, independence was celebrated, but it soon became clear that the USA had a great influence on politics and the economy. In Puerto Rico, a debate about its own status began, which continues to this day. The Caribbean thus entered a new era that was determined by the competition between national self-determination and imperial influence. The Spanish-American War was thus not only a conflict between two states, but a turning point in the history of the Caribbean. He ended Spain's old colonial order and ushered in the era of the United States as the dominant power in the region, an era whose consequences are still felt today.
Chapter 15: The U.S. and its influence in the Caribbean. With the victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898, the United States finally emerged as the new dominant power in the Caribbean. From then on, the region was no longer only an area of European colonial rule, but also a central field of American interest politics. Strategically, economically, and politically, the U.S. saw the Caribbean as its hinterland, a zone it wanted to control in order to secure its security and influence. As early as 1823, President James Monroe had declared with his famous Monroe Doctrine that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonial expansion. Initially, this was more an ideal than a reality, since the United States did not yet have the military strength to enforce this doctrine in the 19th century. But after 1898, the situation changed. With control of Puerto Rico, influence over Cuba, and the growing importance of the planned Panama Canal, the Caribbean moved into the center of American politics. Cuba was the key. Although the island received its formal independence after 1902, the Platt Amendment tied it closely to the United States. The U.S. secured the right to intervene in Cuban affairs at any time and retained the Guantanamo base. In practice, this meant that Cuba had only limited sovereignty. American investors controlled large parts of the sugar industry, banks, and infrastructure. Puerto Rico remained directly under American rule. In 1917, the inhabitants received U.S. citizenship, but to this day, the island is not a full-fledged state. It became a strategic outpost in the Caribbean Sea and served as a base for the U.S. Navy. At the same time, Puerto Rico became economically closely intertwined with the American market, which created opportunities but also dependencies. American influence was not limited to these two islands. In the early 20th century, the U.S. repeatedly intervened militarily in the region, a policy that became known as gunboat diplomacy. Marines landed in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, often on the grounds of preventing political instability or threats to American investment. In fact, however, it was about securing economic interests and strategic positions. Haiti experienced direct American occupation from 1915 to 1934. During this time, the U.S. controlled finances, expanded infrastructure, but also suppressed insurgencies and increased social tensions.
In the Dominican Republic, the American occupation lasted from 1916 to 1924. Both interventions left deep traces in the collective memory and contributed to an ambivalent image of the USA in the Caribbean, on the one hand as a modernizing force, on the other hand as an imperial ruler. The economic dimension was equally decisive. American corporations invested massively in sugar, bananas, and tobacco. Companies such as the United Fruit Company controlled vast areas of cultivation and shaped the economies of entire islands. This dominance led to some parts of Central America and the Caribbean speaking of the Banana Empire, a term for the close ties between local elites and American companies. The Panama Canal, opened in 1914, further strengthened the importance of the Caribbean for the USA. Control over access to the canal made the region a key strategic area. Whoever ruled the Caribbean could oversee trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific, which is one reason why the U.S. consolidated military bases and political alliances in the region. The cultural presence of the USA also increased. American products, movies, music, and lifestyles found their way into Caribbean societies. At the same time, the Caribbean influenced the U.S. Cuban music, Jamaican rhythms, and Caribbean cuisine made their way to New York, Miami, and New Orleans, where large immigrant communities emerged. But American influence was not only economically and culturally controversial, but also politically controversial. Many people in the Caribbean saw the USA as a new colonial ruler who did not always rule directly, but determined the fate through the economy, military, and diplomacy. Nationalist movements emerged that fought against both Europe's colonial presence and American dominance. The U.S., on the other hand, saw itself as the guardian of order. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt formulated the so-called Roosevelt Corollary on the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the United States had the right to intervene in Latin American countries if there was disorder there. This was a direct justification for numerous interventions in the Caribbean. In the course of the 20th century, the Caribbean thus became a testing ground for the foreign policy of the United States. The tensions between self-determination and American control determined the political climate. On the one hand, the islands benefited from investment and infrastructure projects. On the other hand, they suffered from dependency, poverty, and the feeling of having no real sovereignty. So, American influence in the Caribbean was ambivalent. It brought modernization and integration to the world market, but also new forms of dominance. Spain had disappeared, but in its place came a power that was less colonial in the classical sense, but no less decisive. For the inhabitants of the Caribbean, the question remained: how much self-reliance was possible in a region that was permeated by so many external interests?
Chapter 16: The Emergence of New Nation-States in the 20th Century. The 20th century brought a new era for the Caribbean. After centuries of European colonial rule and the increasing influence of the United States, the phase began in which many islands developed their national identity and strove for independence. However, the path to this goal was not uniform. Some territories became sovereign states, others remained closely tied to their former colonial powers or to the United States. What they had in common was the desire to rewrite their own history and secure a place in world politics. The first major wave of independence began after the Second World War. The war had weakened the European colonial powers and strengthened the call for self-determination worldwide. The United Nations, founded in 1945, emphasized the right of peoples to self-determination, and decolonization movements unfolded in Asia and Africa. The Caribbean has been part of this global trend. In the British Caribbean, the process began with the formation of the West Indies Federation in 1958. It was intended to unite several islands, including Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and others, into a common political entity. But the federation broke up as early as 1962 due to internal tensions and different interests. Many islands wanted their own independence instead of a loose alliance. Thus, in 1962, Jamaica became the first major independent state in the English-speaking Caribbean, followed by Trinidad and Tobago in the same year. Barbados gained its independence in 1966, and in the following decades, other islands followed, such as Grenada 1974, Dominica 1978, St. Lucia 1979, or Antigua and Barbuda 1881. Today, most of the former British colonies are sovereign states, although some, such as Jamaica or Barbados until 2021, continued to recognize the British head of state as a symbolic head. France pursued a different path. Instead of releasing its colonies into independence, it integrated them more closely into the French state. Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and Réunion became overseas departments in 1946, and later regions with almost equal rights as metropolitan France. These territories are still part of the European Union and use the euro. For many residents, this meant economic security, but at the same time, it meant ongoing debates about cultural identity and the colonial past. The Netherlands, on the other hand, went its own way. Suriname became independent in 1975, while the Netherlands Antilles were divided into smaller units. Aruba was granted special status in 1986, and since 2010, Curaçao and Saint Martin have been autonomous countries in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, while smaller islands are administered directly by the Netherlands. Here, too, the balance between self-determination and dependence remained a central issue. Puerto Rico, which has been part of the USA since 1898, played a special role. In 1952, it was granted the status of an Estado Libre Asociado, an associated state that has limited autonomy but is not a sovereign state. The residents are U.S. citizens but do not have full voting rights in Congress and no influence on the election of the president. Several referendums were held on the future status, independence, full incorporation as a federal state, or retention of the current state, but a final solution was never reached. Cuba achieved formal independence as early as 1902, but the influence of the USA meant that the country remained dependent for a long time. It was not until the revolution of 1959 under Fidel Castro that this relationship was radically abandoned, and Cuba became a symbol of a self-confident, albeit controversial, national identity. The emergence of new nation-states in the Caribbean was not only a political but also a cultural process. With independence, awareness of its own history grew, especially for the legacy of slavery and colonialism. Poets, musicians, and intellectuals played an important role in strengthening national identities and creating new narratives. Literature, such as the works of Derek Walcott from St. Lucia or Aimé Césaire from Martinique, reflected on the colonial past and formulated visions of a Caribbean future. Music also became an expression of national identity. In Jamaica, reggae symbolized not only cultural creativity but also resistance to oppression. In Trinidad and Tobago, calypso became the voice of political satire and criticism. Such cultural movements gave the new states a strong identity that extended beyond political structures. But independence also brought great challenges. Small island states with limited resources have had to develop their economies, often still dependent on the export of a few products or tourism. Political instability, corruption, and international dependencies were constant problems. Some countries have experienced coups or violent conflicts, such as Grenada in 1983 when the U.S. intervened militarily. Despite these difficulties, the emergence of new nation-states in the 20th century was a milestone. It marked the end of centuries of direct colonial rule and the beginning of a new era in which the people of the Caribbean could shape their own future, even if they remained in a complex web of global dependencies. The diversity of paths, independence, integration, special status, reflects the diversity of the Caribbean itself. Each island found its own way between tradition and modernity, between colonial heritage and national self-confidence. What they had in common, however, was the will to no longer be the plaything of foreign powers, but rather actors in their own history.
Chapter 17: Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution, and the Cold War. The Cuban Revolution was one of the most formative events of the 20th century and made the Caribbean a focal point of world politics for decades. With the victory of Fidel Castro and his rebels in 1959, Cuba transformed from a U.S.-dominated country into a socialist state closely linked to the Soviet Union.
This put the Caribbean at the center of the Cold War, and the island became a symbol of both hope for liberation and fear of communist expansion. Before the revolution, Cuba was a country of contrasts. Officially, it had been independent since 1902, but the reality was different. The Platt Amendment allowed the U.S. direct influence on Cuban politics, and American investors controlled large parts of the economy: the sugar industry, tobacco plantations, banks, and tourism. Havana was a magnet for American tourists in the 1950s, known for casinos, nightclubs, and a glamorous upper class. At the same time, the majority of the population lived in poverty, especially in rural areas. Politically, Cuba was unstable. Numerous governments took turns, many marked by corruption and nepotism. In 1952, former President Fulgencio Batista regained power in a military coup. His regime relied on authoritarian means, U.S. support, and profits from the tourism and gambling sectors. But Batista's dictatorship exacerbated social inequalities and provoked growing resistance. It was in this context that Fidel Castro appeared on stage. The young lawyer and political activist led the attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba in 1953, which failed but became a symbol of resistance. After a prison sentence and exile in Mexico, he returned to Cuba in 1956 with a small group of rebels, including Ernesto Che Guevara. In the Sierra Maestra, a mountain range in the east that is difficult to access, the guerrilla war against Batista's troops began. Over the course of 3 years, the movement grew. Peasants joined the rebels, urban underground organizations supported them, and the corruption and brutality of Batista's regime alienated even sections of the middle class. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled into exile, and Fidel Castro marched into Havana. The revolution had triumphed. At first, it seemed unclear what course the new government would take, but it soon became clear that Castro was striving for far-reaching changes. Large estates were expropriated, American companies were nationalized, education and healthcare were made free, and social reforms were implemented. These measures found great support among the poor, but met with fierce resistance from the elites and the United States. The United States reacted with suspicion and hostility. In 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower broke off diplomatic relations, and in the same year, the new Kennedy administration tried to overthrow Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuban exiles, supported by the CIA, landed on the southern coast of Cuba, but the invasion failed spectacularly. The victory strengthened Castro's reputation and finally drove Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union. The peak of tensions came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union secretly stationed nuclear missiles in Cuba to secure the balance of power vis-à-vis the United States. When American reconnaissance planes discovered the missiles, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. After intensive negotiations between U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union withdrew the missiles. In return, the U.S. undertook not to invade Cuba again. The crisis made Cuba the focal point of the Cold War and, at the same time, showed how dangerous the geopolitical role of the Caribbean had become. In the decades that followed, Cuba remained an integral part of the socialist bloc. The Soviet Union supported the island with loans, oil, and trade, while Cuba sent doctors, teachers, and soldiers to various countries to strengthen international influence. Castro became a symbolic figure for revolutionary movements worldwide, especially in Latin America and Africa. At the same time, the close ties to the Soviet Union led to a strong dependency. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Cuba fell into a serious crisis that became known as the Periodo Especial. Food, fuel, and medicine were scarce, and the population suffered enormous deprivation. Nevertheless, the regime survived, also thanks to new alliances, for example with Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. For the Caribbean as a whole, the Cuban Revolution had far-reaching consequences. It inspired left-wing movements, frightened conservative governments, and led to the U.S. increasing its presence in the region. Many small island states that became independent in the 1960s and 1970s watched Cuba closely, some with admiration, others with fear.
The revolution shaped the image of the Caribbean in the world. Cuba became a symbol of resistance against imperialism, a place of longing for intellectuals and activists, but also an example of authoritarian rule and suppression of political freedoms. Today, the Cuban Revolution remains a central chapter in Caribbean history. It shows how a small island was able to shake up world politics, how global powers carried out their conflicts in the Caribbean, and how profoundly the longing for self-determination and social justice shapes the region. Fidel Castro himself once said, "History will acquit me." Whether this is true remains controversial, but what is certain is that his influence on the Caribbean and the world is undeniable.
Chapter 18: Tourism, Migration, and the Cultural Diversity of the Caribbean. Today, the Caribbean is not only a geographical space, but also a cultural mosaic in which history, migration, and economic developments have created a unique diversity. In the 20th century, two phenomena came to the fore: tourism as the new lifeline of many islands, and migration, which changed the face of societies. Both factors made the region a melting pot that sent cultural impulses into the world far beyond its size. Tourism began to gain importance as early as the early 20th century, especially in Cuba, where Havana became the entertainment center of American visitors. But it was not until after the Second World War that mass tourism developed into a central pillar of many island economies. Modern airplanes, cruise ships, and package tours made the Caribbean a place of longing for travelers from Europe and North America. White beaches, turquoise sea, and tropical climate became the epitome of vacation and exoticism. For many island states whose economies had few viable alternatives after the decline of the plantation economy, tourism became the most important source of income. Hotels, resorts, and cruise ports were built, often with massive foreign participation. Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba soon became among the most visited holiday destinations in the world. Tourism brought foreign currency, jobs, and infrastructure, but also dependency. Because as shiny as the beaches are, as problematic are the structures behind them. Many islands became dependent on international corporations and tour operators who transferred profits abroad. In addition, the focus on tourism led to ecological pressures, destroyed coral reefs, waste problems, and growing pressure on water and energy supplies. The pandemic of the 2020s showed particularly clearly how vulnerable this dependence is. When tourism collapsed, many islands plunged into an economic crisis. Parallel to tourism, migration was a decisive factor. As early as the 19th century, the immigration of contract workers from India, China, and other regions had changed societies. In the 20th century, a new wave began: emigration to the metropolises. Hundreds of thousands of people from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and other islands emigrated to Great Britain, Canada, or the USA in search of work and better living conditions. In the 1940s and 1950s, large Caribbean communities emerged in cities such as London, New York, and Toronto. They left a lasting mark on the culture of their new home countries, from music to cuisine to politics. The Windrush generation in Great Britain, named after the ship Empire Windrush, which brought the first migrants in 1948, became a symbol of this movement. At the same time, migration within the Caribbean remained important. Workers moved from poorer to richer islands, for example to Trinidad during the oil boom, or to the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands during times of tourism growth. These hikes led to new mixtures and further enriched cultural diversity. Today, the Caribbean is a region where the most diverse cultures meet. African, European, Indigenous, Indian, Chinese, and Arab traditions merged into a unique mixture. This diversity is particularly evident in religion. Catholicism, Protestantism, Hinduism, Islam, but also Afro-Caribbean religions such as Vodou, Santeria, or Rastafari shape everyday life. Often, these faiths coexist or mix. Music became probably the best-known expression of this cultural dynamic. Reggae, ska, and dancehall came from Jamaica, calypso and soca from Trinidad and Tobago, salsa and son from Cuba, merengue and bachata from Dominican Republic. These rhythms conquered the world and made the Caribbean a global cultural power.
Bob Marley, Celia Cruz, and Harry Belafonte are just a few of the artists who have achieved international fame. Literature also produced outstanding voices. Derek Walcott from St. Lucia, Nobel Prize winner in 1992, described in his works the tensions between colonial heritage and cultural self-assertion. Aimé Césaire from Martinique was a co-founder of the Negritude movement, which emphasized African heritage and anti-colonial consciousness. Such intellectuals gave the Caribbean a voice on the world stage. Finally, sport became another field of cultural identity. In particular, cricket, introduced by the British, developed into a passion and a symbol of pride and self-confidence in the English-speaking islands. The West Indies cricket team, made up of players from different countries, enjoyed great success in the second half of the 20th century and became a flagship of the region. However, tourism and migration also brought social tensions. In many countries, a two-class society emerged. On the one, in the service sector, often poorly paid, and on the other, wealthy tourists or emigrants who sent foreign currency back. At the same time, migration led to brain drain, as many well-educated young people left their homeland. Despite these problems, the cultural diversity of the Caribbean remains one of its greatest strengths. It is a legacy of the often painful history of colonialism, slavery, and migration, but it has been transformed into creativity, joy to live, and resilience. Today, the Caribbean is more than a tourist dream setting. It is a cultural space that resonates worldwide.
Chapter 19: The Caribbean and its music, reggae, salsa, calypso. If there is one element that has made the Caribbean famous worldwide, it is its music. It is much more than entertainment. It is an expression of history, identity, and resistance. The rhythms that originated in the small islands have shaped entire musical genres around the world. Reggae, salsa, calypso, merengue, bachata, and many other styles bear the traces of the colonial past, the African roots, and the creative power of the people who retained their voices despite oppression. The roots of Caribbean music lie in slavery. The Africans deported to America brought their rhythms, drums, and songs with them. On the plantations, they served not only for entertainment, but also for communication and comfort. Drums could transport secret messages, songs told of longing and hope. This musical tradition merged with European influences, such as the instruments and harmonies of the colonial masters, and with the songs of indigenous peoples. The result is a music that carries the heritage of many cultures. One of the most famous styles is reggae from Jamaica. It emerged in the 1960s from predecessors such as ska and rocksteady. Reggae is characterized by its characteristic offbeat rhythm, which is immediately recognizable. But reggae was never just music for dancing. With artists such as Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Burning Spear, he became the voice of resistance, social justice, and the spiritual Rastafarian movement. Songs like Get Up, Stand Up, or Redemption Song spoke of oppression, hope, and freedom. Reggae made Jamaica world famous and became a global movement. Calypso from Trinidad and Tobago also has a long tradition of resistance and satire. As early as the 19th century, calypso singers sang about life on the plantations, about injustice, and about the powerful. Her songs were often coded commentaries on politics and society, full of humor and irony. In the 20th century, calypso became an international phenomenon, especially through stars such as Mighty Sparrow or Lord Kitchener. The Carnival of Trinidad became the stage on which calypso was not only celebrated, but also used politically. From Cuba came salsa, a music genre that actually originated in the diaspora. In the 1960s and 1970s, Cuban and Puerto Rican musicians in New York took up traditional rhythms such as son, mambo, and cha-cha-cha and mixed them with jazz elements. The result was salsa, energetic, danceable, and full of joie de vivre. Musicians like Celia Cruz, Willie Colon, or Hector Lavoe made salsa world famous. It was an expression of Hispanic identity in the USA and at the same time an export product that conquered the whole world. A rich musical tradition also developed in the Dominican Republic. Merengue became popular in the 19th century and was initially music of ordinary people. Later, it was accepted by the elites and even promoted by the dictator Rafael Trujillo, who elevated merengue to a kind of national identity. In the second half of the 20th century, bachata gained popularity, first in bars and slums, later as a global music style. Today, artists such as Juan Luis Guerra and Romeo Santos are among the international stars. One of the diversity of Caribbean music is also evident in smaller styles. Steel pan music from Trinidad, created from oil drums, became a symbol of creativity. Soca, a mixture of calypso and Indian rhythms, brought new energy to the carnival. Zouk from the French Antilles combines African and European elements. Each island, each community developed its own variant, which at the same time became part of a common Caribbean identity. What all these musical genres have in common is their close connection to history and society. They were not created in luxurious concert halls, but in streets, bars, backyards, and at festivals. They reflect the experiences of poverty, migration, colonialism, and resistance. At the same time, they became an outlet for joy, humor, and joie de vivre. The music of the Caribbean is also an example of globalization from the low. Long before corporations marketed music worldwide, Caribbean rhythms spread through migration, radio, and live performances. Musicians traveled to Europe, North America, or Africa and brought their styles with them. Today, reggae, salsa, and calypso are part of the world's musical canon, played in clubs from Tokyo to Berlin, from Cape Town to Buenos Aires. But the Caribbean remains more than just a supplier of rhythms. Their music is a living expression of cultural resilience. It reminds us that even in times of oppression and hardship, creative power can emerge. Every drum, every melody tells a piece of the region's history, from the horrors of slavery to the struggles for freedom to the joy of carnival. Thus, Caribbean music is not only a cultural heritage, but also a living part of the global dialogue. It connects people across borders, makes them dance and think at the same time. And it shows that a region that has often been considered small and dependent has the power to inspire the world.
Chapter 20: Modern Challenges, Identity, Politics, and Globalization. The Caribbean in the 21st century is a region full of contradictions. It is a dream destination for millions of tourists, but at the same time, a space that struggles with poverty, inequality, and political tensions. It is culturally influential, but often economically dependent. It bears the legacy of colonialism and slavery, but at the same time tries to assert its own identity in the globalized world. The Caribbean's modern challenges cannot be reduced to a single problem. They are a complex web of history, politics, economics, and culture. One of the biggest challenges remains economic dependence. Many islands are small and their resources are limited. Tourism, on which many countries rely, brings foreign exchange and jobs, but makes them extremely vulnerable to global crises. The corona pandemic has shown this drastically. When travel suddenly became impossible, entire economies collapsed. Climate change also threatens tourism, as rising sea levels and stronger hurricanes can destroy beaches, hotels, and infrastructure. In addition to tourism, services such as offshore financial centers or call centers are playing a growing role. Islands such as the Cayman Islands or the Bahamas are known for their banks, which often attract international funds. But this dependence on global financial flows carries risks, as international regulations or economic crises can quickly derail such models. Politically, the Caribbean remains a patchwork quilt. Some countries are independent nation-states, others continue to be part of European powers or tied to the USA with special status. This diversity leads to very different political experiences. While countries such as Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago have built stable democracies, others suffer from corruption, weak institutions, or political instability. Haiti, which was the first country in the region to become independent in 1804, is still marked by crises, natural disasters, and international interference. The question of national identity plays a major role in many countries. After centuries of colonial rule and forced migration from Africa, India, China, or Europe, the societies of the Caribbean are extremely diverse. This diversity is a strength, but it also leads to tensions. Ethnic differences, social inequalities, and debates about colonial heritage shape politics.
At the same time, there are strong movements that emphasize the common Caribbean and promote a regional identity. Organizations such as the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, seek to strengthen economic and political cooperation, even if implementation is often difficult. A particular challenge is the memory of colonialism and slavery. Today, many countries are demanding reparations from the former colonial powers. CARICOM has developed a program that demands reparations for the descendants of slaves. These demands are not only economic, but also symbolic. They are intended to recognize that Europe's wealth was based on the exploitation of the Caribbean. Climate change is perhaps the greatest threat to the future of the region. The Caribbean is located in an area that is particularly vulnerable to hurricanes. Storms like Irma or Maria have devastated entire islands in recent years and shown how vulnerable the region is. Rising sea levels threaten coastal towns, beaches, and even the existence of small islands. For many countries, the fight against climate change is therefore a matter of survival. At the same time, the Caribbean has a strong cultural voice in the world. Music, literature, art, and sports make the region more famous than its size would suggest. Artists such as Bob Marley, Rihanna, and Derek Walcott have made the Caribbean a global cultural space. This cultural presence gives the region self-confidence and international importance. Migration remains another central issue. Many Caribbean residents continue to migrate to the United States, Canada, or Europe, often in search of better economic opportunities. The remittances of this diaspora are a decisive economic factor for many countries. At the same time, emigration leads to a brain drain, as many well-educated young people leave their homeland. The Caribbean is thus a region in the field of tension between dependence and self-determination, between vulnerability and resilience. She struggles with structural problems but also shows great creativity and adaptability. Their history has taught people to find new ways in the midst of oppression and disasters. Globalization presents the region with new challenges but also offers opportunities. Digital technologies, new trade routes, and cultural networking open up opportunities to overcome dependence on tourism and old colonial structures. At the same time, there is still the danger that the Caribbean once again become the plaything of larger powers, this time in the competition between the USA, China, and Europe. Looking back at history, it becomes clear that the Caribbean has never been just a peripheral region, but always a center of global developments, from the slave trade to the plantation economy to the Cold War. Today, in the age of globalization and climate change, it is once again a mirror of the world. Their modern challenges are global challenges, and their solutions could serve as role models for other regions.